The following video contains language that may be inappropriate for young viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Behind the Bars, where we bring the unseen and the unheard stories from the depths of the prison system to the forefront. I'm your host, Jason Boss, and together we'll explore the madness, the chaos, and the harsh realities hidden behind the steel doors of prisons worldwide. From the local jailhouse to death row across the world, we'll show you the isolation, the seclusion, and the decades spent enduring unimaginable conditions. These are the stories of survival, struggle, and humanity in places most of us will never see. We're here to shine a light on what society often forgets, the voices of the incarcerated. Each story is real, each voice is authentic, and every moment reveals the raw, unfiltered truth of life behind the bars. Join me for a journey like no other, a journey into the darkness, the truth, and the resilience of the human spirit. This is Behind the Bars, real life, real stories.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, thank you so much for joining us. You are on Behind the Bars. I am your host, Jason Boss, and today I have a good friend of mine. His name is Shawn Wuertley, who has done a tremendous amount of time in prison, and he is joining us from a prison somewhere in Florida right now, and we have the honor and the privilege of talking to him, and I can't thank him enough. Brother man, Shawn, how are you doing?
Man, it's one day at a time, brother. It's one step forward and two steps back. But Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Yahweh who strengthens me.
Absolutely. That is a beautiful way to intro this. Now, my brother, you have been incarcerated for a long time. Before we get into that, let's dive to the very, very beginning of this whole thing and let's talk childhood. Let's talk the early memories of your life. Now, before we do that, how old are you right now?
I will be 47 years young in less than 3 weeks.
Okay, so in 3 weeks you're going into 48, or are you just 47, right?
I'm going into 47.
47. Okay, well, where did you grow up, and what are some early memories of that world? How did everything go down?
Well, it started off a dark picture, but it's ironic enough, God's never lost control. Everybody says he's in control. He never lost it. I was adopted. Well, first I was born in Bloomington, Indiana, in 1978. My mother was a stripper. My dad was a drug addict, so you can only imagine the combination there. A lot of abuse early on. Was adopted at the age of 2. And just had so many problems that it just, I guess it was to the point of, nobody understands, where a child's mind's at. I don't even think the child understands where his mind at after abuse and so forth. Grew up in a Christian home. On my adopted side, I had one grandfather that was Orthodox Jew, didn't believe in Messiah, and then I had the other grandfather that was a deacon in the church. So you can only imagine the add-on of confusion that was there. But I had a lot of behavior problems, and the only way to deal with that was to send me to out-of-state boarding schools. That landed some issues with me being molested a few times, and more confusion to go with that right there. I'm an open book, so yeah, I got a question. It doesn't matter how personal it is, I share it because it's Yah that gets the glory, I could not be controlled. That most people say, this kid needs discipline. Well, you can only beat a kid so much before it becomes abuse. And I just, there was no way to deal with me. They had me on Mellaril, Tofenol, Spiridol, Haldol, lithium, all these different psychotropic meds. And the problem wasn't psychotropic. The problem was spiritual. And nobody understood that at that time, Jason. Everybody was still caught up in the old psych meds are the best way to go to control our kids, not realizing that, the spiritual way is the way to go to control your kids. Long story short, about 9 or 10, my adopted parents just couldn't handle me no more, and I was given back to the court. Well, at 9 years old, when nobody wants you. So that didn't do nothing for me. I went through some more abuse in and out of the boarding schools and whatnot that I was in. I had no desire to know God whatsoever. That was just somebody made up in a book to me. got tired of being abused, and at the age of 13, I ended up hitting the streets of Detroit as a runaway. Was all over Detroit, would make my way over there to the East Coast. Jersey was one of my favorite areas to go. And just ended up making my own family my own way. Went back to Indiana at one point, got caught there. Again, I'm the ward of the state, so there's an active warrant out for me at that time. A lot of confusion still. While I'm in Detroit, I'm living in the ceiling of a gas station during the wintertime because you're going to die if you're out in the elements of the winter up in Michigan anywhere. But I would get up in there to stay warm. Around, I don't know, it was spring. It was around springtime. I ended up coming out towards on the east side, and there was a dojo for kickboxing. And I would sit outside even in the rain and watch them guys in there doing the kickboxing. Got called inside of there, and that was probably the first Christian believer that I met outside of my family that took me in. And he's like, well, listen, my wife's a school teacher. I'll teach you all the training, in kickboxing and whatnot that you could possibly want to know, but you got to keep your C average with the schoolwork. And I said, man, I'm a runaway. I can't go to school. He's like, we'll deal with that here. No drugs, no alcohol. We do Christian services on Sunday. You will show up, or you're not going to be a part of this. So I did that. Ended up going back to Indiana afterwards, and it's the only thing I was really good at is kickboxing because I had so much anger. And went back to Indiana, got picked up there. I'm trying to consolidate all this because it's quite a story there.
And the Indiana part. Okay, so let me break in real quick. The Indiana part, the kickboxing. What age were you at that when you started doing that?
I'm about 16. No. Yeah, I'm right about 16, going into 17 at that point because I was 17 when they finally caught me back in Indiana.
Okay, so let's there's so much here I want to unpack this because you were talking about 2 years old. Do you remember what's your earliest memories of that time when you were that young?
My grandfather was my best friend. That's the only man. I never heard him curse. I never heard him say anything bad about somebody. I seen him get mad at my grandmother one time, and it was over something that she had said about someone else. And he had said, unless you've walked in that man's shoes, you don't judge another man. That was my hero early on. I learned to ride mopeds with him, and I begged everybody to let me stay with him, live with them. But of course, back then you didn't. You get to choose where you live. Mom and Dad say you live in there, you live in there. That's the end of it.
And so, did you ever meet your original mother and dad? Did you ever have a contact call?
I did.
You did?
I did. Actually, at the age of 18, I got to back up here. At the age of 18, I ended up tracking them down.
Okay.
That turned out to be a little more of a nightmare than what it was worth.
Okay. And so, you said you were adopted around 2 years old. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so that was when you moved. You were into your Christian base, the Jewish grandpa, and then Orthodox other side. Tell me about life with this. You said that you were an out of control kid, and prior to that, you mentioned abuse. What kind of abuse are we talking about? Physical, sexual?
It was sexual.
Sexual abuse, and who was that done by?
I had a cousin next door that was doing it to me, and then I went to a Christian home in Cuero, Texas, and it was done by the house parents there.
And that was at what age? Do you remember?
I was probably about 7 or 8 at that time.
Okay. And when you said you were delving out of control, like you were struggling, that nobody could keep you under control. I have in my notes here like 9 or 10-ish. Is that when you kind of start spiraling? Is that where you think you kind of went downhill?
That's when that's when the dynamite went off. I just, everybody's, talking about this. They're talking about that. You got to fix this. You got to fix that. What's wrong with you? Well, how do I explain to you what's wrong with me when I don't even know what's wrong with me?
And who is that who had these conversations with you?
It would be my father, my adopted father, Norman, or the psychologist, Dr. Lennon, that I had.
And what would you do that was different than what other kids would do? How would you lash out?
Oh, I would take a hammer to my dad's truck windows, the windshields. I chased my sister through the house, with a knife. I mean, the things that most people would never even. I mean, you see that kind of stuff on TV, in horror movies. You don't you don't see it in real life. The last thing you expect is an 8-year-old kid to sit there and get mad because something stupid. The SpaghettiOs wasn't hot enough or something, and goes and does something that irate.
So let's talk about the incident with the hammer to your dad's truck. What set that off? What was the triggering point of that particular incident?
Honestly, I would say, if looking back on it, Jason, I would say it's frustration of not being understood. I don't believe there's such thing as a bad kid. I believe that there's kids that make bad choices, and I was one of those kids that I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on with me. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. So the frustration would make me act out in a way that would give me attention, but it wasn't the right attention, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and did you, at any point, did your parents sit down with you and befriend you, or were you just kind of expected a certain direction?
Oh no, my parents were like old fashioned. You don't look back at your mother. You don't sit there and talk back, and spare the rod, spoil the child. At points I wish it was a rod I was hit with, but that belt's quite more unforgiving than that little rod.
And when you were, let's go back to the incident of chasing your sister through the house with a knife. What set that off? And were you trying to actually hit her with it, or was this just an act?
You know what? I don't know whether I was actually trying to or not. I think if I was actually going to do it, I would have done it, because there wasn't no medium with me. It was either all out or nothing. Usually, if I said I was going to do something, I did it.
Mm-hmm.
My sister, I think she was asking me to sit down and do something, don't go outside or something. My parents were at some kind of church event, and I wasn't having none of it. I mean, the slightest thing would just send me overboard.
Now, where do you think that stems from, that just going from 0 to 100 real fast?
I don't know. I've slowed down a lot, but I mean, even as you can hear in my voice now, I talk fast. At one point in time, I stopped to where I was doing things so quickly, talking so fast, and mind racing so much. And then I did 10 years on solitary straight, and that just screwed my mind up even more, to where I just, everything's got to get rushed out, if that makes sense. Or in other words, the best way to describe that would be I got more coming into my mind than I'm able to get it out.
Now, up to the 9 and 10 years old, and this kind of a breakdown, do you feel like you had people that truly loved you, that had your very best interests at stake?
I think more than anything, I think it was my grandfather. I think because he would fight for me, even if I was dead wrong. He would fight for me and sit there and say, it's not a mistake if you learn from it, sonny boy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, but the rest of my family didn't see it that way.
So is it safe to say that you just, besides him, you have not felt a true connection with either a male or a female in a parental setting ever? Yeah, that would be, until recently. I was adopted, as an adult. I think I shared with you that. Mm-hmm.
And that turned out to be, it gets to the point to where, the old me wants to rear its head, and I try to keep it in the grave, but it wants to pop up and be like, you can't trust nobody.
Mm.
And that's how my mind was. If I don't trust you, I don't have to worry about getting hurt.
Right. Okay, so between 13, you were, okay, so on my notes here, you basically ran away at 13. You were essentially homeless or on the run per se.
A little bit of both.
So at 13, tell me about that very first moment that you decided that was, what made you jump from a house, from a home, and decide to go rogue at 13? What was that day like, and where did you go?
Well, the court had been placing me in group homes and foster cares and all these other places, and I'd just been sent to, what was that? That's been years ago. The Family Support Center in Indianapolis. I'm there, and I keep in mind I was raised up, out in the country and whatnot. So I wasn't around other ethnicities or things like that. So when I roll in there and, a honky this and honky that, well, what's a honky? I don't even know what a honky is, My parents wasn't raised like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or they didn't raise me like that. So, I had to adjust, and then I got in a fight there. And then they were like, okay, well, we're going to move you over to the villages. And I'm like, well, you guys just keep moving me from here to here. I ended up getting arrested. First time I'd ever gotten arrested as an adult. As a juvie. And
this is at 13?
Yeah, I was 13.
Okay.
Long story short on that, the psychologist calls in and talks to me, and he's like, what's going on? I said, man, I'm fit to kill this kid, this, that, and the other. He's like, no, you're not. You're going to do the right thing. You're going to go to the group home. You're going to start over fresh. I said, Dr. Lennon, I'm tired of starting over fresh. I said, every time I go somewhere, I said, someone's either trying to screw me or they're trying to, get the best of me. I said, I'm done with this.
Now,
just give it one more chance.
How many homes had you been in from? Because at 10 years old, your parents gave you back to the courts. So from 10 to 13, how many homes were you in?
Oh, well, no, even before that, I started off, they sent me at like 7. I think it was like 7 or 8. I went to, can I say the name of the place?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it was Christian Corral Ranch down in Cuero, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was abused there, and my mom came down with my grandmother to visit me and seen something wasn't right. She had no idea that I'd gone through all that. I was pretty good at holding things in. Went back to Indiana, started getting even crazier, sneaking out at night, taking my four-wheeler 2, 3 o'clock in the morning out on the highways and all that. But so they sent me to Oneida Christian Academy in Kentucky. I ran away from there. Went back to Indiana, again showing my butt. And then they sent me out to Missouri, American Home for Troubled Youth. I was out there and managed to con my way up out of that place. That didn't work, so they put me in Humana Hospital. That didn't work. They put me in Charter Hospital. That didn't work. So then they went to the court and said, we can't control this guy no more. We put him on meds. He's tearing the things up. He's sneaking out at night. It's a never-ending ordeal with him in regards to me. So the court picked me up, and then that's when I started going into even more counseling every single day, back to Humana Hospital, then to the, like I said, the group home. I get to the group home, and the guy there was a Christian, tried his best. He said, I don't think you're a bad kid. He said, I just think you're misunderstood. And I said, well, I wish you'd tell the rest of the world that. Went through that process there, got into a lot of fights with the kids. I'm one of those guys, I don't like you putting your hands on me. You can call me anything, and anything you want to call me, just don't put your hands on me. Mm-hmm. And you're in the city there. I'm a country boy, so that wasn't working out so well. And finally, I ended up helping one of the ladies move, and she molested me. Well, everybody's like, oh, well, that's the best thing ever, I'm like, well, no, it doesn't matter whether it's a guy or a girl, At that age right there, a kid shouldn't be going through that garbage.
And what age was that?
What's wrong with? I was 13.
13.
That was the final straw. I said, I'm out of here. And ended up taking off. I'd always liked to.
By the time by the time you were 13, how many times do you think you've been molested by different people?
At least 4 or 5 times.
Wow. Okay, so 13, you decided that was it, and you took off.
Yeah, I just said, you know what, I'll take my chances on the streets.
And what did that look like? Were you literally went to the streets? How did that go down?
Well, I'd always been my brother Jeff was in the Air Force, so I'd always been a military fan. I love my country. I don't necessarily agree with everything that goes on, but I still love my country. And I said, at one point in time, I'm going to be in the military at some point. Grew up knowing that. So I said, well, what better training opportunities than, to be able to say at 13 years old, I went out and became a soldier. I guess I was living in my own little reality. Some of it was fantasy, just to try to get through each day, Jason. It doesn't matter what was going on around me. I tried to stay in my own little world where I was safe.
No.
So I packed everything. Go ahead.
Were you living in where did you live? What, in the streets?
Wherever I could get up underneath. If I could get up underneath a car at a car lot, the lower cars the better, I'd sleep there. If I could get inside of a car, I'd sleep in there. Gas stations with them lower tops, ceilings right there, you can get in there and sleep on one of the beams. That's what I did up there when I finally did get into Detroit. I got to a gas station that there was very few of those back there that didn't stay open 24 hours, and this was one of them that would close. So when the lights would go out, I'd come down, get into their squill buckets, and eat, whatever leftovers that they had that they'd throw in that squill bucket in the cooler. That was my dinner, and that's how I survived.
Wow. Okay, so this is 13, and then this, you lived, basically a homeless life.
Yeah, almost 4 years.
Okay, and then so take me through that. What are your experiences, as a homeless, individual? Where did you get clothes? How did you swap clothes? Do laundry? Any of that stuff? What was that life like?
Well, yeah, there's plenty of water up there, so you can always wash. I just sit there and rinse off. It's not like you can actually wash. I'm not working a job or anything like that. But go into grocery stores and just walk around eating food, or go in the bathroom with the food and eat it in there. Walmart wasn't a real big thing up in that area there, but they had other stores that you could just go into. Goodwill up there, you could go up in there and just change out. I put other clothes up underneath the clothes I had on and roll out that way. There's a Catholic church up there. I ended up sleeping underneath the pews there a few times, and the priest ended up getting me some clothes there as well. I really wasn't trying to trust no one, so I would try to do most of the stuff I could on my own.
Now, did you ever end up doing any drugs during these times?
Oh, absolutely. Anything that usually the old winos and whatnot. I didn't really have a lot of kids until I got into I was 15 or 16. So a few years, I'm talking to the winos and drinking whatever's left over in their bottles. Dope was plentiful up in there. When I say dope, I'm talking about reefer, Mary Jane. So I'd smoke a little bit of weed.
And when did that start? When was your first intake of drugs at all?
Oh, I was probably about 14. I wasn't on the streets very long before I started actually. I'd smoke some weed or drink some the old Mad Dog 20 back in the day. And
this was hanging out with the homeless guys, where this was the same what they were doing?
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's homeless all through Detroit. You can go over there. Eminem sings about the old 8 Mile and everything, but there's old factories and stuff. Even back then, some of the factories was going down. You could go hide out back in the back by the factories and whatnot.
Okay, so when did this take us to, I guess, your first arrest as a? I said you got arrested the first time at 13 as a kid. Did you get arrested at any point during those 4 years you were homeless?
No, I laid low. If there was a cop to be around, I'd wave and keep right on trucking.
Mm-hmm. All right, so 16 years old, you were sitting outside, or this was around the kickboxing guys outside. Yep. This is kind of where I interrupted you the first time. So take me through from 16 to how did the kickboxing thing go down? Did you stick around that long, and what happened there?
Well, I stayed outside mostly. I was, like I said, if I didn't let you get close to me, I didn't have to worry about you hurting me or betraying me. And one day I just happened to be out there. There was, it wasn't right in front of the place, but there was a bus stop just to the caddy corner to where you could still see in through the bay windows and watch them train. They were pretty perceptive of what goes on around there, so they see me out there sitting on the bench in the rain watching. Invited me in, and I wouldn't come in. And then they had a younger daughter. They sent her out there to talk to me. I guess I said, well, yeah, all right, I'll come on in. Came in, and they were a Christian couple, real kind. She was a school teacher. He was former military, had been hurt, and that was what he did. He taught kickboxing and did some kind of clinical psychology stuff in Detroit for, I don't know, whether it was like the campus or whatnot.
All right, and so how did that go down? What was that, and how long did you stick around there?
I just told him point blank. I said, listen, I said, I'm not what I appear to be. I said, I'm on my own. And he said, well, I kind of, in short, I kind of picked that up. He said, nobody just sits out in the rain on a park bench unless they're waiting for a bus. He said, you wasn't getting on no bus, so he said, where are you from? I said, I'm from Indiana. What's your name? I said, you can just call me Shawn. But they ended up feeding me. Offered me to stay there, and I said, no, I'm good on that. I said, I would like to come and learn how to do this, though. I'd like to learn to be able to protect myself. And he says, he'd asked me, he said, about my temper and whatnot. And I said, yeah, I've always been an open guy. I don't hide nothing. You don't have to point out my flaws. I'll tell them to you in a heartbeat. But I told him, I struggle with, anger. And he asked me why that was, and I said, I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. He says, well, you don't have to explain it right now. Let's just try to get that anger out of you. And he says, well, everything you're angry at, he says, I just want you to put it all into that bag. He says, there is no right way of doing it. He said, let's just start doing that right there. And then before we would leave, everybody, even the ones that paid student-wise, he'd make sure everybody came together in a circle and prayed. That went on for a little while. I started getting better at it, and I was like, maybe this is what I want to do. And then when I sit there and told him I wanted to be in the military, he was like, wow, it brings a whole new meaning to things. So, I trusted him somewhat, but I never completely trusted anybody other than my grandfather until not quite my 18th birthday. I don't want to get ahead on that, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so where did this go from here? How long were you at this kickboxing place with this guy? How did that end?
I ended up taking off and going back to Indiana. And I hadn't planned on staying in Indiana, but I'd always, cared about my grandfather. So when I was on my way down to Indiana, stolen car, the car breaks down. So the cop ends up coming behind me while I'm on I-70, walking, and pulls over. And I didn't, at this point, I'm tired. I've been all over. I'm just wore out, dirty. I'm hungry. And I just told him, I'm going to run away.
And this is when you were 17?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and then the car that was stolen, did you just jump in a car and take off?
The car had already stopped. It some kind of mechanical failure on it. So I had been walking down the interstate when the cop saw me. He didn't see me actually get out of the car. I never got charged with that.
Okay, so you are 17 years old, walking down the road. Was in a stolen car, didn't get charged with it. The cop, you were worn and tired and beat, and you just told him you were a runaway. What happens?
Puts me in the car. We end up he feeds me out of his lunchbox. I'll never forget that. It's probably the only good encounter I've ever had with a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
But they end up taking me to the Marion County Holding. My caseworker picked me up the next day and sent me to Richmond State Hospital.
Now, what kind of hospital is that? Is that just a regular hospital?
Oh no, it's psych.
It's psych.
It's got everything. That thing's been around for years. I don't think it's around now, but it was around then.
Okay, so what was that like going into that? I mean, you had been in psych hospitals before, right?
Right. I got in there, and right off the top, I exhausted, everything else. So I rested up enough, got my energy back, and then it was straight fight mode. You couldn't talk to me. They four-wayed me to the chair. They had what was called the safe chair, where they actually use leather restraints to where they four-way you to it. It's no party, let me tell you. Finally, I ended up getting into it with another kid that was there and hurt him. The administrator there then said, well, you know what, if you're going to act like an adult, we're just going to go ahead and move you to the adult wing. So they moved me to the adult wing, and I talked them into letting me go out to where I could, give me an hour a day, and then that turned into like 3 or 4 hours. They'd open the door, and then I would go out running in the morning. I love to run. Got to talking with the security guy there. He was in a Rover Jeep, so he was always around. Was talking to him. He was prior military. He said, keep doing what you're doing. I said, I don't think I'm ever going to make it. He said, you're never going to know unless you keep trying. He said, keep doing it. He said, keep running every day. And he said, get your thoughts clear. And he said, pick you up a Bible. I said, man, I ain't even thinking about no Bible. It's amazing the people that Yah has placed in in my path that, you know, tried to get, you know, he tried to talk to me all along. Everybody says, you know, why doesn't God talk to us? Well, he does talk. The problem is you're not listening. And that was me. So I'm doing all that, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to contact a local recruiter and see if, you know, there's people that's been placed in the military younger than what I am. Let me see what I can do. So I contact the recruiter, and he's like, yeah, why don't you come in and take the ASVAB? I said, well, yeah, that would be real nice if I wasn't down here at some mental institution. And he started laughing. He says, you serious? And I said, yeah. So I kind of shared with him a little bit what I shared with you, and he's like, you know, let me see what I can do about getting you up out of there. And I said, well, that'd be nice, you know. So caseworker at that point, county caseworker agrees that if I pass the GED pretest, then I can go and take the ASVAB to join the military. So I get the GED, I pass the pretest, I go down and take the ASVAB, and the recruiter's like, when did you quit school? I said, a long time ago. He said, kid, you know, you're not doing great. He said, but you're not doing terrible. He said, you know, let me see about trying to get you in. So there's a hearing held. The court's like, no, you don't understand. This guy's got problems. And he says, no, he's misunderstood. He said, let me take him. He said, I'll take him. I'll be responsible. The judge says, no, we're not. No, he said, well, let the military have him. He says, the military doesn't want this kid here. And Sergeant Shawn Fuller was his name. He was part of the Richmond National Guard. He says, yes, he said, actually, he said, we do want him. The judge said, well, you're just going to have to wait till he gets his GED and he's done with the court system. So I go back to the hospital. I'm deflated, discouraged, and whatnot, start acting out again. And finally my caseworker's like, you know what, I'm going to move you away from this guy, which seems to be the norm. Every time, you know, things started to get better, they would uproot me and send me somewhere else. So I go out to, at that point right there, they send me out to Chipotle School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, this is in 1996. While there, I try out for the track and field team. I'm doing that right there and make captain of the team. It's probably the only time I've ever been in any kind of leadership. The court gives you an allowance, so you know all my money's going on model airplanes and tanks and military memorabilia and whatnot. So I remember one day I'm in my room and I'm putting together some planes, and a guy walks by and then he stops. He does a double take and backs up. Well, I got POW flag on my wall. I've got an American flag on my wall, models hanging from the window, and tanks galore. And he states, you know, permission to come in? I said, come on in. This is your house, not mine. So he comes in. His name's Brian, and him and me's talking. And he's like, wow, you know, what are these here? I said, that's B-52, that's A-10, you know, that's an F-15 Eagle. That's a replica of an M16A1. You know, I know the terms. I've been reading up on it. And I said, you know, he says, well, what do you want to do with your life? I said, well, at some point, I said, you know, I'm going to go in the military. And he started smiling. I said, what's so funny? He said, nothing. He said, you're on your way. So him and me started talking off and on. I told him about Sergeant Fuller and all this, and he's like, you know, you're getting a raw deal this time, kid. He said, I don't like this. He said, you just keep doing what you're doing, keep studying. So I take the trash out one day, and it's nighttime, and I'm not supposed to be smoking. But the kids can smoke there, but if you're a part of the track team or any kind of athletics department, you're not permitted to be smoking. So I'm smoking a cigarette, and I hear ting, ting, ting. And I look, and you can see the shininess off of it, and I end up walking over there to it. It's a Budweiser. It's a Navy Budweiser, which is what your SEALs use. Some of them call it Trident. So I pick it up, and I look at him, and I said, you know, what is this? I said, you're a SEAL? He said, no, I was. He said, back then, he said, we called them frogmen. He said, I got hurt during Vietnam. So we get to talking. He said, what are you doing smoking? And I said, ain't nobody around. He said, Shawn, he said, always remember this. He said, if you're going to go in the military, he says, you got to understand something. He says, and if you only remember this one thing, he said, remember this. He said, integrity is doing what's right even when no one's around. Mm-hmm. So I ended up giving him my lighter and whatnot. So I don't know. It's maybe 2 weeks later, Jason, and he wakes me up. It's like almost 12:30 at night. So I'm thinking, the first thing I'm thinking is, oh, man, this guy's going to be sick too. Here comes another sicko wanting to touch me or something. Mm-hmm. He said, come in the office. So I go in the office. He said, pick up that phone. I pick up the phone. He's got Sergeant Fuller on me. He says, what are you doing hanging around with the enemy? I said, what do you mean? He says, you got a Navy guy right there. He said, what are you doing talking to the Navy guy? Just giving me a hard time to go. He said, listen, he said, you're scheduled to go get your GED, he said, here in about a week or two. He says, stick with Brian. He said, keep doing what you're doing. He said, this guy really does care about you. And I said, yeah, he's probably the first real friend I've had. So we ended off of that. And the day before, I'm probably going to get choked up on this one now. The day before, I'm to go take the test. Everybody's got their heads down. You can see people's been crying and everything else. And lo and behold, Brian's sister comes to me, and both of them are Christians. And she says, you got a second? We need to talk. And I'm like, yeah, where's Brian? She's like, he's not here. She said, let's go for a talk, or let's go for a walk. She said, let's go to the chapel. I said, we can talk out here. I don't want to go to no church. She said, no, we need to go into the chapel. So we go in the chapel there, and she tells me that Brian was killed that night.
Wow.
So I picked up probably every hymnal there was in that church and threw it at the crucifix. Told him, I said, I told her, I said, that's your God? That's what your God does? I said, for people that serve him, that's your creator? I said, God help me if I ever find religion. I walked out and just started hitting the track, and just ran until my legs started cramping and throwing up and all that. And she's sitting out there. She's like, you don't understand his purpose. I said, I know this much. I said, he took a good man and left us these monsters here on the planet. I said, he's taking all the good people and leaving the monsters. I said, I don't want no part of you, God. And threw explicits up in there too. So the next day, I go to take the GED, and obviously I'm still distraught. So I just said, I'll never forget. I finished taking the GED. I put the pencil down, and I'll never forget the words I said. I said, lock and load, Brian. Took off, managed to go to the bathroom, went out the window away from the staff that was sitting out there waiting, and hit the woods. Sprained my ankle while I was in the woods, and stopped at a college and got a ride to Greenwood, Indiana. By now, I already know where my mom's at, my biological. Move in with her and call my former it'd be my former first sergeant, Shane, the recruiter, and said, hey, man, this is where I'm at. I'm laying low. I said, as soon as I get the results on the GED, I'm enlisted. Are you ready? He said, I'll be out there this week to see you before you even get the results. He said, let's get on this. And I told him everything that was going on. Get the results, enlist, and in the process thereof, met the first love of my life. Never had a girlfriend up to this point. Most guys are like, well, you're 17 years old, you never had a girlfriend? That's right, I haven't. So I meet her, and lo and behold, she's a believer. And I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me with this church stuff, man. I look back on it now and kind of laugh, but back then there was nothing funny that, with me in regards to religion. I had no desire for that whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Everybody that had served, the Most High, they was either gone or something crazy happened to them, So her and I get to go on in the relationship, and she's like, you ain't sleeping with me, none of that stuff till there's a ring on this finger, and we're married, we're doing this the right way. And I'm like, okay, well, as soon as I complete basic and everything, we'll get married. Her dad was a retired Army colonel, so I ended up going to church with her a few times. I'm miserable as all get out. I was sitting in the pew with her, but I was doing it to make her happy. Shane, Sergeant Fuller, got it to where I was able to attend guard drills prior to basic, but I couldn't handle, any ammunition or armaments or anything like that because I hadn't been properly trained. So I'm going to the drills. He's like, you need everything that you got going for you. He said, if you're wanting to go Ranger on that, he says, you got a lot to work on. He said, you are not there yet. I'm like, all right, whatever. I'll do whatever I got to do to earn that title. And, I wanted to be a tough guy. Everybody wants to be a tough guy. Nobody wants to be just a normal guy. Mm-hmm. But while I was at drills one weekend, that Sunday, she was coming to pick me up and ended up hydroplaning and was killed in the process of coming to get me.
This was your girlfriend?
Yeah, we'd actually engaged at that point right there. Was going to go to basic, and then after I finished basic, we was going to get married.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's, within a matter of, not even a year, I just lost my best friend, and then the love of my life. So I went into a spiral. I'm homeless at that time right there. I moved out of my mom's house. Just didn't want to be around anybody. I always told everybody, there was only one friend for me, and that was alcohol. Her dad, Todd, ended up finding me passed out on her grave and sat there. And after the second time, he's like, all right, we got to do something. Who's your recruiter? And I told him, he's like, yeah, I'm going to make some calls. So he calls my recruiter and says, listen, we don't get him in some kind of detox and then shipped out. He stands no chance of being any kind of useful soldier. He said, this kid's all over the place. So they put me in detox. I'm in detox for like, I don't know, it's about 24, 48 hours or something like that. I leave there. They take me to MEPS to swear me in and all that, fly me down to Fort Benning. I'm down there at Fort Benning. I'm doing great. I'm halfway through basic and ended up having a dream about her and just lost it. Threatened the DI. He's like, no, you're not going nowhere. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll meet you downrange. I said, when I put this, 30-round magazine in your head right there, I said, is that going to be enough to get me out of here then? So they ended up taking me over to the chaplain. I got tossed out of the military with a RE3, which allowed me to re-enlist in 2 years. Her dad had helped me get that because they wasn't even going to give me that, give me an uncharacterized discharge. Come back to Indiana, and I'm like, yeah, this isn't working.
So you are...
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Boss, and I'm the host of Behind the Bars. First, I want to thank you for watching, sharing, and supporting our channel. This project means the world to us because it's about giving a voice to the unheard. The men and women behind the bars who share their raw, unfiltered stories of life, mistakes, redemption, and lessons learned. But here's the reality. Because of the nature of our content, Behind the Bars will never be monetized by YouTube. And that's okay. We're not doing this for the money, but to keep telling you these stories, to keep bringing you interviews from across the plains, we need your help. Right now, we're sitting on over 15 incredible interviews that are waiting to be edited and shared. We've got the footage, but we need the resources. More interviews mean more editors, more work, and a bigger team to make this vision a reality. And that's where you come in. By becoming a Patreon today, you're not just helping bring us these stories to life. You're also getting exclusive access to behind-the-scenes conversations and untold stories that won't be available on YouTube. These are the moments that take you deeper into the lives of our interviewees, as well as the challenges and triumphs we face while we are creating this channel. If you've ever been moved by one of these stories, if you believe in the power of second chances and in a shining light on the human experience, please consider supporting us. With your help, we can reach further and roll out even more of the content you love. So from the bottom of my heart and from all of us here at Behind the Bars, thank you for being a part of this journey. Much love to you, y'all, and we'll see you in the next episode.
You had just basically got kicked out of not really kicked out, but I guess in some way you kicked out of the military. Take me from that point there.
So I ended up coming back to Indiana, and I get me a ticket to Greyhound. I called my adopted mother and told her, I said, I just got left out. I lied to her and told her I, took a medical and gotten out of the military. I said, I need some money to get back to Indiana. Of course, my brother was in the Air Force. Jeff was in the Air Force, and told my mom, he said, no, they should be paying for that if it's a medical discharge. So she said, I don't care. I'm sending him the money he needs to get back home. So I come back up to Indiana, and, of course, I go straight to her grave and sit there, and I told her, I said, I don't know what to do. I said, I've lost everything. I said, now my goals are gone too. I said, where do I go? What do I do now? I said, where's your God in all this? I mocked God an awful lot. Ended up going and talking to her dad, and he's like, you don't need the military. He said, you need God. And I said, listen, I'm tired of hearing about, this creator. I said, I ain't had nothing but pain, I said, from everybody that served him. And I said, how about your daughter? I said, how's God working out for your daughter there, Todd? I said, yeah, she's in the ground. I said, where's he at? I said, that's right, nowhere to be found. Left there and ended up borrowing a buddy of mine's Jeep. And this was one weekend. I'd been drinking a little bit, and one weekend I drive by this church, and I'm like, all right. So let's see what where you at? Where you at? All right, I'm here. Where are you at? So I go in there, I sit on the back pew, and there's a lady in front of me, but I was quiet about it and everything, but I sit down there, and I guess she must have smelled it on me. Looked back at me, gave me a dirty look, and about 2 or 3 minutes later, she goes and gets the deacons or whoever. They asked me to step outside there with them. He says, sir, have you been drinking? I said, yes, sir, I have. He said, well, what are you doing here? I said, I'm trying to find some answers. And he says, well, you need to come back when you're sober. I said, come back when I'm sober. I said, yeah, you got to be kidding me, right? He said, yeah, you're not welcome here right now. I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, you jerks ain't welcome in my life either. I said, if this is what your Jesus and your God's got to offer, I said, I don't want no part of it. So I roll out of there and end up going and smoking a joint, just sitting there trying to figure things out. So a buddy of mine, I talked to him. He's like, man, why don't you go get a job? He said, you're disciplined enough. He said, go get a job working for the sheriff's department. I said, yeah, me a cop. I said, yeah, you got jokes, right? So about 2 or 3 weeks later, again, he says, listen, man, he said, I'm working at the jail there. He said, why don't you put a job? I said, man, I can't even pass the analysis right now. I said, are you kidding me? He's like, listen, give it a few weeks, clean up. He said, got good benefits and all that. He says, you might be able to use that to go back in the service. I said, man, I don't even know where I am right now. I said, I don't know who I am right now. So I go and clean up, go and work for the jail. And I'm like, man, this ain't cutting it right here. These guys are just they're more criminals than some of the guys I was running with out there. They're not too far from their own DC number. Left there and said, what, I'm going to get into some fighting. I'm going to see what I can do. And hooked up with a guy that used to be a state cop and started running hot cars with him and was getting some money off of that way. Got introduced to heroin at that point at his bar. Needed a way to support my habit, so I'm like, I'll boost some cars with you. He said, this guy does some prize fights up there. He said in Chicago, and I said, well, I don't know that I'm ready for that kind of stuff right there. I said, I can fight a little bit. I said, but I ain't no Bruce Lee. So I started training for that, trying to clean up on that right there while trying to do heroin. So that's like an oxymoron. How are you going to sit there and do all that while using?
Were you slamming? Were you slamming heroin?
Yeah, I was mainlining.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you were practicing for prize fighting and slamming heroin. Go on.
Right. I don't want to come across. I don't want to come across as if I'm some tough guy. I'm not. I'm probably the most humblest guy in the world now. But I was an arrogant individual back then. You couldn't tell me nothing. And I ended up. This guy was an old Italian and ran some. There wasn't actual contracted fights or anything like that. It just guys come off the streets and you fight and jump in the cage and do your thing. And $100, you win that fight, you get $100. This ain't thousands of dollars or anything like that. So I was doing that, and they found out I was mainlining. And he's like, no, that's over with. We do fights. It's enough stuff we do that's under the table as it is. The last thing we're going to do is have some drug addict coming in here too. And I'm like, well, up yours. Went back to my buddy that was a former cop, and he's like, man, why don't you just run hot cars, man? You're good at that. You can do that right there. So I started running hot cars, and I'd never done anything to the point to where I was going to hurt anybody, but I always kept a pistol on me. So I'm driving.
And what age are we at right about now? 19ish, 20?
I'm still 18 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, all this is moving, and there's no break between any of this. I'm just boom, 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 boom. It's like there's never a pause in my life.
All right. So 18, man, you are young and gunning. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so what's that?
Boosting cars it is, so keep on.
Right, yeah, so I'm boosting cars. I move in with this girl I met, and I'm staying with her and her dad up there in Indiana. So I'm boosting cars. I end up working at a 7-Eleven at nighttime as well because I'm stealing stuff still. And long story short, they bust me for stealing. I think I stole like $1,400 or $1,500 out of the cash register, and went and bought me a Camaro, and ended up getting arrested. That was the first time as an adult I was arrested for petty theft in Marion County. That's Indianapolis right there.
Mm-hmm.
Did I don't know, I think I did like 18 days or something like that in the county jail in the bullpen and whatnot. Was supposed to be on probation, violated that, went back and did another 2 weeks, and that started the actual ball rolling for doing time.
Mm.
Left there, went to Martinsville, Indiana, hooked back up with the former cop, started running hot cars again. This time I'm going into the dealerships, taking the security down, and then going to get whatever keys I want to whatever vehicle, grabbing a plate, one of the solid plates, tossing it on whatever vehicle I want, and driving it to, Chicago or Cicero. I was all over. Chicago, Toledo, Detroit, Memphis, all over there, and then sometimes over there to Philly.
Were they chopping these cars up then?
Yeah, oh yeah. You're getting, they would just, there wasn't no replating, nothing. They just sit there and take the parts and add them on the different vehicles and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. So you were basically, so when you were popping these hot cars, this was back. I mean, so 18. This is kind of pre-security camera stuff. And so you were literally just like breaking into the dealerships, grabbing the keys, grabbing the cars, and did you run into pushback? Was there anybody there that ever caught you at these dealerships?
No, actually what I would do is I would usually a glass cutter. I'd take a glass cutter, and then I would pop that glass open, run my hand through, and see if there's any actual contacts on the top of the door. That would let me know if there was an actual, because most of your security systems are going to run with 2 points of contacts on the top of the actual door where it connects from the frame to the door itself.
Yeah. Okay, so
do that.
Yeah, let's keep rolling. So you were back popping cars with this guy.
Yeah, going in and just I figured I stood a better chance. Most guys would just sit there and crack the ignition columns. I did, but I got pulled over once and was fortunate enough that the cop didn't get to see the actual ignition. He told me to slow it down. He had me another car, or he had him another call. So I got off on that, and I said that was too close to comfort. And everybody's like, man, no, just, just pop him. It's so much easier. I said, no. If you get pulled over, it ain't going to do you no good when he sees that cracked column. So I was actually going into the dealership. So when it was all said and done, when they did finally catch me, they was charging me for burglary of the dealership, theft of the plates, theft of the keys, and theft of the automobile. So I ended up going and doing time in Indiana, auto theft and all that other stuff. I went in there as a medium security prisoner, but I was so violent that they ended up upping me to a maximum security prisoner. See, I started off at Plainfield Correctional Facility, which is a medium security. Throwed out of there, sent to Pendleton, behind the wall. You got a lot of lifers and everything there. But they threw me out and sent me to the maximum control complex, which is inside of another prison in Westville, Indiana.
Now, what was
what
was happening between? I mean, where did the violence pick up? Were we just duking it out with other guys, or how did that go down?
Oh no, these officers.
Yeah,
I had no respect for authority whatsoever. There was, after seeing what I saw working at the jail and then being around former cops and whatnot, I'm like, who are you? You're just as dirty as I am. Who are you to sit there and tell me? Again, like I said, Jason, I was an arrogant individual. I had no respect. I didn't respect myself, so I couldn't respect anyone else,
Okay. All right. So you're moved to Pendleton, and you said behind the walls. What happened there, and how'd that go?
I got into it with the captain there, and he's like, no, we're not dealing with you. You're already a problem child for Plainfield. We're going to ship you on out of here. So they sent me to the maximum control complex, which is a 24-hour lockdown unit up there. It's a prison inside of another prison. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
When you come out, you're shackled, you're handcuffed. The handcuffs have got a leash to it. They come down between the bottom of your leg irons, so if you get stupid, they just pull your feet out from underneath of you.
Wow. All right, so how long were you there, and how did that go down?
Oh, probably, I don't know, about a year maybe, I connected up with a former staff sergeant of mine. He took me under his wing. He said, "Listen, he said, I'll help you out, but I catch you lying to me one time, it's over." So he started looking out for me, visiting, writing, tried to get me to start memorizing Bible verses. Long story short with that, he picks me up. I get out, and we're thinking I don't have to do any work release or anything. So he gets me a job. I get settled. I go to probation to check in, and they're like, "Oh, no, you got to go to work release." And he's like, "There's no way for us to work through this right here. He's already set up. He's got a job. He's staying with me, da-da-da-da-da." And they're like, "No." So I go to work release. Well, here it is. I've got 3 courtrooms I'm doing time out of. 3 counties I'm on probation in. Everybody wants money. They want these fines and costs. This courtroom wants this court costs and fines. This courtroom wants that. The probation department wants this. I'm $1,500 behind in Department of Motor Vehicle fines and whatnot. So I'm working and busting my butt. Everybody's wanting money, and I'm like, man, I ain't got it. I got more going out than what I got coming in. So got discouraged. Ended up leaving work and going to a strip club. Hung out with a stripper for the night. Ended up going and staying with my grandmother the next night. She talks me into going to church. Come back from church, and lo and behold, the sheriff's department's waiting on me. So they pick me up for escape. I go back to the county jail that I was in, Johnson County Jail. They hold me over. I don't want to be in there, so I just cop out on the 4 years for the escape charge because I'm already in violation of probation. They screw up and run it. Yeah, so I go back to prison. And while I'm there, they tell me you're in violation of probation. When you get done with your sentence, you're going to go to the court on this. I said, yeah, kidding me? I said, you're going to deal with me now. I'm not going to get out and end up coming right back. So I file some stuff in court, go back to the county jail on a probation violation and everything, and they end up running it concurrent with my sentence. That was a blessing. While I'm in the county jail, I talked to this guy. I'm like, hey, man, that's your girlfriend there? He's like, yeah. He says, her name's Michelle. So he's like, he said, yeah. He said, that's my girl there. I said, she got any friends or anything like that? I said, man, I'm going to need some pen pals. I said, I ain't interested in no romance. He's like, yeah. He said, let me see what we can do. So she tries to hook me up with her friend. I'm talking to her, writing through the mail and everything to her. Well, my buddy ends up doing Michelle wrong. So Michelle starts writing me. Kind of start getting a little bit of the feelings and whatnot. And I'm like, you know what? I ain't ever really loved but one woman. Maybe I could learn to love this girl. I'm 20-some years old. I think I'm 26, 27. So I'm like, all right, maybe I can learn. I still haven't got it figured out, So her and I get to talking. She's visiting and whatnot. Some feelings get involved. And she's like, when you get figured out, why don't you move in with me? And I'm like, what? If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Let me try this God thing. So, and that was a good step for me there. It wasn't the final, that's for sure, but it was the first step towards acknowledging that, okay, you're real. So I get out, we get married. I said I do, found out, Lord, no, what did I do? Instead of I do, what did I do? Fell in love with her parents. Her parents are awesome, God-fearing people. Went to church with her, tried to do the whole God thing, and that's when I learned that, there's a difference between knowing about God and actually having a relationship with Yah. And that's a big difference, and people get it twisted. And I just wasn't there yet. So here it is. I've got an 8-year-old son. His name's Shawn. So I'm like trying to be the dad because he was born while I was incarcerated. I'm like, how do I do this? I can't even control my life. What am I going to do for this kid, man? I'm damn sure not trying to screw this kid's life up. So he falls in love with my ex. And, I'm like trying to balance things out with them right there because, he loves being around her. And finally, I'm just like, you know what? Her and I's not getting along. The court's wanting more money. I'm making buku money building a stadium for the Indianapolis Colts. So, I've got my new truck, good-looking wife, money in my pocket, and everything else, and I'm still miserable. And I'm like, why? Why am I still miserable? I got money. I can sit there and smoke some dope from time to time. I'm drinking. New truck. There's nothing that I could possibly need. And I'm still miserable, though. So her and I get into it. She's pregnant. I take off to go to Florida. I'm like, I'm not starting a new life, man. Forget it all. This kid's better off without me. I'm trying to excuse the fact that I'm not owning up to my responsibilities to my son, let alone my pregnant wife. Come down to Florida. This wasn't exactly the new start I had in mind, but hook up with some chicks down here, partying it up. I get back on the heroin, and long story short on that, my grandfather's best friend lived down here. He's since passed, but he takes me out there on a sailboat. So what was supposed to have been a day trip selling, he's got me out there, and he's like, you might as well get comfortable. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, we're not going back in for a couple weeks. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Man, I got a job. I said, I just sat there and lied my tail off to get this security job. I forged the dates on my DD-214 to make it look like I was an 11-year military police veteran. I said, I can't just sit there and be off of work. He's like, I've already talked to your boss. Everybody knows that you're on that crap. And I said, well, that's my business. He's like, no. He said, I owe this to your grandfather, and you owe it to your grandfather. He said, you can either kill me and try to sell it back. He said, good luck. He said, you can try to swim back. He said, you get eaten before you get to the side of the shore. So I stay out there. And I'm like, dude, listen, I just wanted to die. I'm coming off to this dope. I'm dope sick. Every bone in my body, and even parts of my body I didn't even know existed, is aching, throwing up. He's cleaning me up, the whole 9 yards. And then a little over, I don't know, it's about 9 days into this. I'm out there on the deck, laying on my back, still sick, but not as bad as the first day for obvious reasons. But I'm looking up and I'm seeing the stars, and I'm like, it's like nothing nobody sees out on the regular, on regular land, because this is too much light pollution. Mm. And I'm looking up, seeing all these stars, and I'm like, holy crap, you have to exist. There's no way that all this came into play. And I said, God, I said, if you're real, either change me or take me out, because I can't keep going like this. So we end up going back on shore. I get back to shore. He throws me the keys to the boat. He said, that's yours. I said, what? He's like, that's your boat. He said, you have no reason to fail now. He said, you got a place you can live. He said, you got an opportunity to travel. And he said, you got the greatest tool. He said, to isolate yourself and do like Christ did. He said, going out, he said, away from everybody and to desolate areas, he said, praying. And I said, well, I won't go that far there to sit there and say I'm going to get close to God. He said, well, you better get close to him. He said, rather sooner than later. He said, you're not promised tomorrow, Shawn. And I just, I mocked him, of course, but come back. I'm working at the resort, a whore dog and a half right there. It's spring break. There's beautiful girls galore. There's dope galore. There's alcohol galore. I'm in my sinful element. A buddy of mine starts hanging out down there, and he sells dope. So I'm like, hey, listen, man. I said, tell you what, I'll cover it for you. I said, I'll outfit you with a radio. I said, I'll cover it for you. I said, when Beach PD, I said, or ATB, Alcohol Tobacco Bureau's here, I said, I'll get on the radio and tell you to stand down. I said, give me $300 every other night. I said, you're making thousands of dollars down here off of this right here. I said, you got hundreds and hundreds of spring breakers you're serving dope with. So we do that. End up hooking up with this girl. She's down from Alabama. She's down from Alabama. I'm in my late 20s. She got no business being with this teeny bopper. She's 18. We hook up, do our thing a few times. She cops some dope off of him. The next day I come back in, and he's like, hey, man, I need that other $150. I'm like, $150 for what? And he says, them Barbies you got off of me, or she got off of me. I said, she paid you for that. He says, no, she came back and got some more on your face. I said, you don't ever do that. I said, that's just a piece right there. I said, that ain't my girl, man. So I go to her room. We go to a room that we had earlier, vacant. We get into it. She spits in my face. I snap. I put her on the wall. Told her, if you spit in my face again, I'll kill you. She spits in my face again. We've been drinking, high as a kite. That doesn't excuse what I did. And I chuck her ass off the 7th floor. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Why did you, I already know after I've done it, I'm like, wait, you just went over the top right there. You went past the point of no return. You just tried to kill someone now. I get down there, try to play like I'm rendering aid. That didn't go over well. I'm not a very good actor nor a good liar, so I just, I don't even bother to try. So I go to the police department. I do know that I got a warrant out of Indiana on me for violation of probation and whatnot. So I'm denying everything. I don't know. I talked to her then just in passing, No, we've never been together, blah, 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 blah. I'm trying to get out of there before that NCIC comes back showing there's a warrant. They should have ran an actual check on me prior to the interrogation, but they didn't. A couple officers lost a job on that. So I end up rolling out of there, hightailing it back to a girlfriend's house that I was living with. Cops show up there. I'm hiding in the woods and whatnot. Make my way back to an aunt's house down here, get taken into custody, go into court. They're sitting there saying, what was it, sexual battery, false imprisonment, and second-degree attempted murder. And I'm like, well, where the hell did the sexual battery crap come into play here? So I talked to my lawyer. I said, listen, man, I don't deny being a pervert. I said, I'm like any other man. I said, I'm trying to get with every girl I can down there. I said, but there's a big difference between a pervert and a rapist. Right? And he's like, listen, it's all right. We're going to get through this, blah, 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 blah. Or she said, it's all right. We're going to get through this, da-da-da-da. I said, well, listen, I said, her and I had been at the house together. I said, we had relations in the car. We was at McDonald's together, Walmart together. I said, this ain't adding up. I said, she's saying in this affidavit, I said, that we'd never been together. I said, there's physical evidence out there to show otherwise. So it's ignored, of course. And then another guy I'm talking to, never sit there and share your story with another inmate. Never, because you can be dead to the right. He's going to sit there and twist it for his benefit. So he goes and says, I admit to all this, so there's a conflict. They give me a conflict lawyer. And I said, and they're like, well, the private investigator shows up. And I'm like, well, what's up with all this right here? Why haven't all this been done? She said, well, we didn't know there was any DNA anywhere. I said, there's DNA at the house. I said, there's DNA in the car. I said, we're on surveillance and all this. I said, this is going to refute everything she's saying. I said, I don't deny. I said, I tried to take her life. I said, that's for her, them to try to prove. None of that got processed. Long story short, I go to trial. They've done changed and amended the charges a half a dozen times. Another girl jumps on this, and she was might have been assaulted. She don't remember. So they're charging me. Media's all over the place. ABC, Fox News, CNN, Associated Press. I mean, my aunts my grandmother was out in Colorado and finding out about me off of CNN. So, I mean, it went, all over the nation. So I'm like, what are we going to do about this? He says, it's normal. He says, people, they smell opportunity at the money. He said, that resort should have never hired you. You got a felony background and all this other stuff. I said, okay, I got a felony background. I'm not a rapist or a freaking murderer. And he's like, well, we'll deal with it in court. I said, I'm not too, optimistic, I said, about dealing with these people in the court. So we go to trial. Right before trial, he offers me 30 years. I'm mad. Told the prosecutor, I'll take 30. You take 15, I'll take 15. We're going to be cellmates. When we both get out of prison, I said, we'll go register together. But once again, just being my cocky self. Go to trial. I beat everything except for that they found me guilty of a lesser-included offense of aggravated battery instead of what I was guilty of on the attempted murder. Not guilty on the kidnapping. Her friend got up and actually stood up for me on that. And then they got my DNA in her, so you got a sexual battery charge as well there. They run in concurrent or consecutive to each other. I just got a 30-year sentence. And 5 on a false imprisonment on another charge. So I'm like, you know what, this is crazy. So my former father-in-law and mother-in-law is down here visiting, and they're like, you're so ungrateful, Shawn. And I said, what do you mean you're so ungrateful? I'm so ungrateful. My father-in-law says, what did you say you asked God for? I said, to spare me of a life sentence. He says, he didn't just spare you of one life sentence, knucklehead. He said, the kidnapping and the attempted murder were both life sentences. He said, he spared you of 2 of them. He said, and you're worried about what somebody else is labeling you? I said, it's a pervert charge, Dad. I said, it's a pervert charge. Nobody takes a pervert serious. I said, that's a life sentence right there. He said, you don't know what God. I said, oh, here we go with this God crap again. So I go to prison. I'm in prison for a few years. I'd already been to CM, controlled management lockdown, for a few years for fighting and knives and all this garbage. And I'm out running the track. And one of the Christian guys, his name's Greg. I'll never forget the most solid Christian guy I ever met in my life. He's running. He comes in behind me while I was running the track. He said, hey, man, you're on the thing for Kairos. I said, I don't even know what Kairos is. He said, it's the thing at the chapel. I said, I don't do the chapel. I said, the only time I'm going to that chapel, I said, is to drop dope or knives. And he says, well, you're on that list, man. I said, I don't care. You can put me on any list you want. I said, I'm not going up there to no chapel. I said, you go hang out with them other God freaks. I said, I ain't got no room for your God, your Jesus, or anybody else in my life, man. So about a week later, I get notified. No, this was a month before. I'm already notified that from a chick that I had actually had relations with while I was down in Florida prior to me turning 18, or prior to me turning 19. She contacts me and says, hey, you've got a son. So, so I'm notified that, would I like to take a DNA test? I'm like, well, yeah, I'm not just going to sit there and claim something, And she's like, well, I tried to find you, but, it was just that one night, da-da-da-da-da. So, sure enough, comes back 99 point, some percent, that's mine. I said, all right. His name's Shawn. So I got two boys named Shawn. So he's a Christian. He's a drum player at a church, honor roll student. I'm like, well, I don't know how the heck that happened like that, because I ain't ever done anything good in my life. And she's like, would you like to get to know him? I said, well, sure. She said, well, let me talk with him a little bit, blah, 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 blah. So about a few days before I was to go to the Kairos retreat that they had at RDCI, this is in 2014, I call him and we're talking. He's like, you really should. I tell him about the retreat thing. I said, I don't really do the God thing. I said, but you can talk to me about God if you want. And he's like, well, there's nothing else to really talk about, Dad. He said, that's what I live for. And I'm like, well, if that's what works for you. He says, it's not about what works for me. He said, it's the truth. So he says, you should really go to the retreat thing. And I'm like, Shawn, I don't really do the God thing. I said, I haven't really, He says, you haven't given him a chance. I said, Shawn, I said, I can't argue with you. He says, well, what do you have to lose by going and trying? And I said, okay, I'll go and check it out. So I go to this retreat thing. While I'm there, before I get up there, I see this guy posted up on the by the gate, and I tell my buddy Greg, the one that told me I was on the list. I'm like, what is this? I said, a cop convention? And he said, those ain't cops. I said, that's a cop right there. I said, he's either a cop, I said, or he's a former soldier. He says, well, how do you know that by looking? He said, he's a volunteer. I said, you see the way he's got his arms placed? I said, he's wore a load-bearing vest. I said, he's either wore a load-bearing vest, I said, or he's wore a Kevlar vest. And I said, cops will sit there and do that to alleviate pressure off the vest. I said, the same thing a soldier does. He says, he's not a cop. So sure enough, he turns, and now he goes to he brings his hands down to his waist and does the same thing down there. I said, that's off of a Kelly belt. I said, he's prior law enforcement. I said, he's holding his hands like that. I said, to alleviate the pressure, I said, from the hips off of his gear. I said, it's a habit. I said, you can't break it. He's like, he's not a cop. Where do you come up with this stuff? I said, all right, whatever, Greg. So we get in there to the chapel, and they start talking about what the Kairos thing is and everything else, and that, God is real, and, the woes in their life. So they get up there, they're crying. These volunteers, I say they. The volunteers are crying, talking about, that they're flawed too, and this, that, and the other. And I look at Greg, and I said, you got me up here with a bunch of crybabies, man. I said, I ain't with this. I said, all I keep hearing about is Jesus and God and misery. I said, that doesn't sound like anything real impressive right there. So then the guy gets up there, and the one I pointed out, his name was Corporal Bob Burns. He's actually a minister down in Safety Harbor now. I still talk with him from time to time. Amazing guy. If you ever get to talk to him, I'll point him out to you sometime. But he gets up there and he says, some people think I'm a pansy. He said, because I look out for an inmate, or I give an inmate an extra tray or a blanket or whatnot. He says, my name is Bob Burns. I'm also known as Corporal Bob Burns. And I look over there at my partner, and I'm like, I told you he was a freaking cop. So we go through, and then I get to talking to another volunteer. His name was Dan. He was a chaplain, old man, but he reminded me of my grandfather. He turns out to be a former California highway patrolman. I'm like, well, you got me down there. Cop convention, man. So I'm reluctant to open up, and they're like, well, what is your push off against God? And I tell him, the story about how I went to the church, and they told me, come back when, I'm sober and whatnot. And I'll never forget, a couple of the volunteers started breaking down, and they said, that's not how our God operates. He said, and that's not how real believers operate. And I said, well, that's how your brothers operated at that church, that's for sure. So some time goes on. It's like a 3 or 4 day event. And the last day, they dress up the table with tablecloth, and then they surprise you with a bag full of handwritten letters. So I go through that right there. I get to the last one. I see a construction paper, and it's got a cross on the front, and then it says, Yeshua loves you. You open it up, and it says, ow, ow, ow. He's on the cross. So I flip the card over, and it says Caleb, 8 years old, and I just lost it.
So who's Caleb?
I hit my knees. Caleb. His name was Caleb. It turns out he was a autistic little boy, and they didn't know whose bag to place the card in. And it just so happened the cop turned around and said, "No, I know this the one." And they put. There's a thing with me when it comes to kids and animals. Listen here, I'll fight the whole world off to look out for a child or an animal, and God knows that. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'll tell you something later on about my issue with God refining the edges using children and animals to do it. So I hit my knees and I said, God, if you're real, change me. And it was just the most, it was almost like, it's like I was covered in warm oil. And I just felt the most peace that I'd never, most peace I ever felt in my life. I mean, Jason, it was like I wasn't in prison. There was nothing that was holding me back. There was no worries. There was no pain. No defenses. I didn't have no reason to be hostile or aggressive or anything, man. It was like everything just changed for me. And I said, Yeshua, I said, if you'll change my life, I said, I'll go wherever you want me to go. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I said, I don't know whether you can use me with this garbage that I have on my record and whatnot. I said, but, I said, if you'll send me and you'll change me and you'll use me, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So everything goes good. I go back. I tell my son. He's excited. I said, I gave my life, I said, to the Father today. I said, I don't really know where I'm going yet, Shawn. I said, but I'm trying. I said, I hope I turn out to be the dad that you need me to be. And he says, Daddy, I want you to understand, just because you become a believer doesn't mean that all your problems go away. He said, it just means, that you don't walk alone. He said, through those problems. And I'll never forget that, because that was the last call. It was the last call I had with my son. Kept calling the next few days, and no answer. And finally, the phone rang, and then someone answered, and the guy was a cop. He said, well, it's actually in one of our bins here. He said, this was taken out of an on-site accident app. He said, let me get you, to the investigator. So I'm on at this point, I'm on, a cell phone I had no business being on, so I can't explain to the cop that, hey, I'm in prison. Long story short, he's like, yeah. He said, who are you? I said, this is my son's phone. I said, I'm calling. He says, nobody got in touch with you? I said, no, sir. I said, it's hard to get in touch with me. He said, you need to talk with our chaplain with the sheriff's department here. He said, let me, transfer you over. So I talked with the chaplain. He's like, yeah, your son was killed. Him and his mother was killed. He said, what we know, he said, is they was at a party, and his mother had a little bit too much to drink, and he said the car went off the road. He said, any consolidants. He said, there wasn't a lot of pain. And I lost it. I said, then told Greg, I said, once again, I said, I told you. I said, everything that has to do with God, I said, turns back to be painful, man. And I said, man, I don't want no part of this, man. So I went back to my cell and just broke down. And I said, what is it? What is it you want? I said, just spell it out for me. I said, because I can't figure you out. I said, I don't understand you. I said, every time I get close to someone, I said, or every time I surrender my will to something, I said, everything falls apart. I said, it's a crap storm. And I just literally, I said, I don't know what you want me to do. And later on that evening, I prayed some more and sat there and talked with a couple of brothers. They prayed for me. Went and seen the chaplain, and we prayed and came back. And finally that night, I told God, I said, listen, I don't understand, but I trust you. I said, I don't understand. So I go through, about a week of fighting it and trying to get through. And finally I said, you know what, I've had enough. The day before, I had told Greg, I said, man, I don't have no batteries for my MP. I said, I'd like to listen to my Third Day, which is a Christian group my son loved. And he never did violate any rules in that, so it was ironic that this played out the way it did. So I'm not thinking anything about him bringing me batteries. I'd asked it for him like 2 or 3 days prior to, so finally I was like, you know what, forget this. So took me a bunch of pills and rolled me a joint of K2. That thing was probably enough to kill a horse. I wrote a note that said I went to find my wife and my son, and then laid it down there on beside me, put my earbuds in my ear, and put on the Third Day, Let Me Love You. I'll never forget that song. And just faded off. All I remembered was I kept hitting that joint, hitting it until I couldn't hit it no more, and then just went out. Well, I had done gotten so many daggone Zanny bars that, how I'm talking today is a miracle within itself. Ate it all, and Greg showed up and knocked on the cell door. I'd had the cell door covered up with a towel. And conveniently, he thought he heard me sit there and say, come on in. Comes in, and I'm out. He seen the note and then realized, that my shirt, I had a hole burnt in my shirt where the joint had actually burnt through when I passed out. Drags me into the shower. I'm in the shower. He's got cold water, everything coming on me. I don't remember none of this. All I know is flatlined. They gave me up to medical, shoved something down my throat, tried to pump stuff in me, get to see the EMS. I don't know none of this. They pump me full of charcoal, transport me out, whatnot. Flatline again, bring me back. They come back to, after I think it was like 3 or 4 days out of the hospital, they send me back to the prison. The prison rules it as if I just overdosed, wasn't an actual suicide thing. I just lose it. I can't focus. I'm smoking that K2 crap again and again and again. It's burning my brain up. Ended up going and transferring, and got caught with some knives. Go back to CM. Get off the CM. Go to another institution, and I'm like, God, I don't understand this. You delivered me from this, and I just had the biggest peace ever in my life, and then now I'm back in turmoil. Why? And finally, a buddy of mine sat there and said, man, you just got to sit there and go on a fast. And I'm like, man, I'm not no Pentecostal, man. I'm not no lay your hands on all this stuff right here. And he's like, you don't have to be. He says, but if you ever want to try to get back to what you was, he said, you have to surrender everything. He said, because you're in some serious battles right now. And he said, this isn't no kickboxing match, Shawn. He said, this is a spiritual battle here. He said, you can't fight. He said, under any kind of ROEs. He said, with that right there. He said, you got to go full-fledged surrender and let him fight. So I did that, and everything started changing. And I met another chaplain. His name's Steve. Steve Walsh. He's the chaplain over there at Okaloosa CI. So he starts working with me. And I'm like, Steve, I don't understand it, man. I said, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing now. I said, I can't get any play in court. I said, I belong in prison. I said, I did what I did. I said, I didn't do everything. I said, but I'm more than wanted. I said, but I got these pervert charges. I said, ain't nobody going to sit there and take me for real on this, man. And he said, there's many people, he said, that was rejected. He said that he turned around and used. He said, nobody liked the fishermen. He said, Shawn, he said, but yet he said, the lowliest of the low. He said he used a tax collector. He said, and a zealot. He said, do you know what that is? And then he started breaking that down to me. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well. So I asked God, I said, what is it? I don't understand this. I'm giving my life to you. You've taken my wife. You've taken my son. I've got this pervert charge. What is it? You expect me to really do something with the charges I have now? And Jason, I swear I was the most frustrated individual that ever walked the face of this planet. But about a week later, it hit me. It woke me up out of a dead sleep in the middle of the night. He's like, what's the wages of sin? I said, death. He's like, that's right. The wages of sin. That's one sin, Shawn, is death. He said, you're down here. All right, so I'm sick. He's like, what's the wages of sin? Death. He said, just one. He says, you're down here. He says, you're cheating on your wife, committing adultery, you're drinking, you're stealing from guests, you're taking advantage of people. You tried to kill one of my children. And you're worried about what the world says you are, or what the world places a label on you as? And it hit me. I'm like, oh, wow. You know what I'm saying? we're so quick to talk about, well, we didn't do this or we didn't do that. Well, it doesn't matter what we say. In man's law and his law is two different things. And I started realizing that. I'm like, Scripture says what it says, and it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. That's his word. So I started changing everything. I said, you know what? Use me wherever you can use me. And that's the key. The key to it all is surrender. It's not getting in there kickboxing. It's not getting in there fighting. It's not getting in there stabbing. It's not getting in there trying to do anything of your own physical force. It's getting to the point where you says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Well, he's right. You can't. So I go back to the institution I was thrown out of. I'm there. And they send me to, ironic enough, they send me to a faith-based facility. So I go to a faith-based facility. I'm completing the classes, and I help a guy save him from losing a bunch of phones, cell phones. Those ain't allowed. And in turn, he allows me to start using his phone to get on the internet. So I'm doing that, talking to people. I'm still starting to get depressed again. And one night I'm sitting there thinking, man, I'm just going to do it the right way this time. It's a back and forth. Matthew talks about how, the seeds, some seeds planted in a rocky soil, some planted, and just barely takes roots, and then the sun comes up and dries it out. Well, that was me. I could never get my roots down deep enough, because I was still holding on to my efforts. So one night I'm sitting there thinking, this is it, man. I'm looking at the light. I'm like, I'm just going to hang myself. There ain't no way of coming back off of a broken neck. So I'm on Facebook, and then I'm goofing around on some other sites and whatnot, and it gets Christian singles, and I'm like, yeah, fat chance with that. First off, I don't do the Christian thing. Second thing, the last thing I'm thinking about is trying to marry some girl or date some girl. So, kicks and giggles, I put up in there. I said, listen, I'm in prison. I didn't do everything that I'm convicted of, but I didn't warrant enough to warrant prison. I'm not interested in sex. I'm not interested in pictures. I'm not interested in anything but other than a friend. Well, about 10 minutes later, I get a ping, and I start talking to this girl named Jennifer. She's a believer and whatnot, and we start breaking down. She's like a Christian, and I'm like, well, I break down the Sabbath with her and whatnot. And she's like, where are you getting all this? And I said, it's in the Scriptures. I said, they don't want you to see the truth. And she says, well, my Bible says this and this, Sunday this. I said, well, I can make a book say anything. I said, but if you get into a real Bible, I said, you're going to see that it's not adding up. And I'm like, well, wait a second. How am I going from sitting and talking, I want to kill myself, to talking about, religious facts with her? What kind of fruitcake am I? So we get to going, get to talking, and again, almost like deja vu of my first marriage, we get to talking and whatnot. Well, she converts into Messianic Judaism and everything just changed. She's got a daughter that's, she's got 3 daughters, and the middle one is 14, McKaylee, but she goes by Gracie. And once again, God uses this kid to just melt me. And she's like, you can be a part of our family, Shawn. So we start growing, and now, here it is. 4 years later, we're looking at getting married. I've been clear of DRs for quite a few years now. I'm looking at possibly going to New York to do the rest of my time. And I'm leading a Messianic Shabbat service here every Friday. So it's like, God's been calling me all along, but I just haven't been listening, Jason. It's the story of everybody's life, but nobody realizes that my story is everybody else's life. They've got the same story. They just may have it in different areas of their life, not maybe per se exact, but similarities. And it all comes down to, if you don't surrender, you're never going to get nowhere. You can sit there and mash that pedal down on that Jeep in that mud all day long, and it's going to spin, man. You got to get somebody to get some traction up underneath that to get out. And if you're not using Yahushua as your traction, you're dead in the water, man.
Absolutely. Wow, that has been an amazing story, my brother. I think this is probably close to the end of this podcast, and for anybody that is listening into this podcast, in the description below, I'm going to leave a couple different ways to contact Shawn and to support him and to give him a little bit of love. And, Shawn, I really, 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 really appreciate this testimony. This was one of the most heartfelt conversations I think I've had. I don't think I've almost cracked up as many times as I have during this, this afternoon. I've been blessed by the creator of the universe to be able to have these kind of conversations with brothers such as yourself. And I thank you very much for coming on this podcast, for being a part of this. And I hope I can get you on this podcast another time. You willing to come back on?
Anytime, Jason. Anytime, brother.
All right, my brother. And to everybody out there, thank you again for being on Behind the Bars podcast. This is Shawn Wuertley, and it's been a pleasure. Much love to y'all. Shawn, thank you very much.